There's a god in Greek mythology who was cast off Mount Olympus twice, not for crimes or rebellion or any of the dramatic reasons that usually get gods expelled from paradise. He was thrown away simply for existing, for being born wrong, for not meeting the standards of divine perfection that Olympus demanded. His name was Hephaestus, and his mother, Hera, queen of heaven, goddess of marriage and legitimacy, took one look at her newborn son and hurled him off the mountain. Some versions say he was born lame, deformed, with twisted legs that marked him as imperfect. Some versions say he was born perfectly healthy, but Hera threw him anyway, and the fall itself crippled him. But all versions agree on this: he survived. He fell for an entire day, plummeting from the realm of gods down to the mortal world, and he hit the ocean and kept falling through the water until he reached the very bottom. And there, in the deepest depths where no light reaches, he was found by sea nymphs who took pity on the broken god-child and raised him in secret. And in that underwater cave, rejected and forgotten by the family that should have loved him, Hephaestus discovered something that would make him more valuable than any of the perfect gods above. He learned to create. Think about what that rejection means. Your first experience of existence is being deemed unworthy. Your first memory is falling. Your first lesson is that love is conditional, that belonging depends on meeting standards you never chose, that even a mother's love has limits, and those limits are defined by how you look. That's not just trauma. That's the foundation of an entire identity built on being unwanted. And Hephaestus spent years, maybe decades, maybe centuries in that underwater grotto, learning his craft in darkness and solitude, creating beauty and function from raw materials, because creation was the only thing that gave his existence meaning. He became the greatest craftsman who ever existed, god or mortal, not despite his rejection, but because of it. Because when you're thrown away, when you're told you're not good enough just for being alive, you have two choices. You can internalize that message and become small, or you can prove them wrong through excellence so undeniable that even the people who rejected you have to acknowledge it. Hephaestus chose the second path, and it destroyed him even as it saved him. Let's start with Hera, because understanding Hephaestus requires understanding his mother and the complicated, toxic, ultimately devastating relationship between them. Hera was trapped in a marriage to Zeus, eternally suffering his infidelities, eternally powerless to punish him directly. She was the goddess of marriage, but couldn't leave her own marriage. She was the protector of families, but couldn't protect her own dignity. And at some point, consumed by resentment and rage, she decided to do what Zeus had done when he produced Athena without her involvement. She would create a child alone, through sheer divine will, through parthenogenesis, through the assertion that she needed no man, not even Zeus, to bring life into existence. She would have a child that was entirely hers, a son who would prove her power, her capability, her independence from the husband who humiliated her constantly. And she gave birth to Hephaestus. Some myths say Zeus was the father anyway, that Hera's attempt at solo creation failed, and Zeus contributed without her knowledge or against her will. Other myths insist Hephaestus was entirely Hera's creation, born from her alone. But what matters is this: when Hera looked at her child, whether he was born deformed or whether she simply decided he wasn't perfect enough, she rejected him. She took the baby she had wanted, the child who was supposed to prove her power and independence, and she threw him away. Literally threw him off Olympus because he didn't meet her standards of divine perfection. Because in her quest to prove she didn't need Zeus, she created a son who reminded her of her own powerlessness, her own compromised position, her own failure to produce the perfect heir who would validate her suffering. That's the deepest wound, isn't it? Not being rejected by strangers or enemies, but being rejected by the person whose love should have been unconditional. Being deemed unworthy by the one who created you. Hephaestus didn't fall from Olympus because of anything he did. He fell because of what he was, what he represented, what his existence said about his mother's situation. He was collateral damage in Hera's war with Zeus, a victim of divine politics before he was old enough to understand what politics meant. And he spent his formative years underwater, in darkness, raised by Thetis and Eurynome. Sea nymphs showed him the kindness his own mother couldn't, who taught him that he had value, who gave him tools and materials, and watched him discover that his hands, however imperfect his legs might be, could create miracles. Hephaestus made his first masterpiece in that cave, a throne, golden and beautiful and intricate beyond anything that had ever been crafted, and he sent it to Olympus as a gift for his mother. The throne arrived, and Hera, delighted by its beauty, sat down immediately, and the moment she sat, invisible chains bound her. She couldn't move, couldn't stand, couldn't escape. The throne was a prison disguised as a gift, revenge disguised as reconciliation. Hephaestus had created something so beautiful that Hera couldn't resist it, and so clever that she couldn't escape it. And from his cave beneath the ocean, he had his answer to the question of whether he mattered. He mattered enough that even Olympus needed him. Even the gods who'd thrown him away needed the rejected son to set them free. The gods sent messenger after messenger begging Hephaestus to return and release Hera. He refused them all. Why should he help the woman who'd tried to kill him? Why should he return to the place that had cast him out? Why should he use his skills to serve people who'd made it clear he wasn't good enough to be one of them? But finally, Dionysus went down to the cave, not with threats or commands, but with wine and companionship and the offer of a place, a real place, on Olympus. Not as the rejected son crawling back, but as the craftsman whose skills were essential, whose work was irreplaceable, whose return was being requested rather than demanded. And Hephaestus, perhaps lonely, perhaps curious, perhaps simply ready to confront the people who'd hurt him, agreed. He returned to Olympus, he freed his mother, and he claimed his position as the god of the forge, the divine craftsman, the maker of miracles. But claiming that position didn't heal the wound, didn't erase the rejection, didn't make him belong in the way that the other gods belonged. Hephaestus was always other, always marked by his disability, his limp, his ugliness in a realm of perfect beauty. The other gods were tall and graceful and beautiful. Hephaestus was short and twisted and malformed. They spent their time at banquets and festivals and elaborate divine celebrations. He spent his time in his workshop, creating the tools and weapons and palaces that made their lives possible. He was essential, but never celebrated, needed, but never loved. The god who did the actual work while everyone else played and called it ruling. And that dynamic, that constant reinforcement that his value lay only in what he could produce rather than who he was, shaped everything about how he interacted with the world. Let's talk about what Hephaestus created, because his work was legendary. He forged Zeus's lightning bolts, the weapons that made Zeus king. He created Poseidon's trident. He built automated servants, robots made of gold that could move and think and assist him in his workshop. He crafted Achilles' armor, so perfect that it was described in poetry for hundreds of lines, every detail of its decoration recorded, because the armor itself was a work of art. He made Pandora, the first woman, at Zeus's command, crafting her from clay with such skill that she was indistinguishable from a goddess. He built palaces for the gods, each one a masterpiece of architecture and engineering. He created weapons that could kill immortals, chains that could bind titans, thrones that were beautiful enough to be irresistible and clever enough to be traps. Everything the gods needed, everything that made Olympus function, everything that gave the gods their power, came from Hephaestus's forge. And what did he get in return? He got to be the god that other gods laughed at, the one they mocked for his appearance, for his disability, for being different. He got to be essential and invisible simultaneously, valued for his output but not respected as a person. He got to be the only god who worked, who actually labored, who spent his days sweating over a forge while the others lounged around being beautiful and dramatic. He got to be needed without being wanted, essential without being loved. And that paradox, that constant experience of being simultaneously crucial and contemptible, created in Hephaestus a character that was part genius, part victim, part bitter cynic who understood exactly how transactional his relationships with the other gods actually were. But then, something happened that changed everything, that took Hephaestus' story from tragedy to something even more complicated. He got married. Zeus, in his infinite wisdom and absolute lack of emotional intelligence, decided that Hephaestus should marry Aphrodite, the ugliest god and the most beautiful goddess, the craftsman who spent his days in a forge, and the goddess of love and beauty who spent her time being desired by literally everyone. Some versions say this was a reward, Zeus's way of giving Hephaestus the ultimate prize. Some versions say it was a punishment for Aphrodite, a way to control her dangerous sexuality by binding her to a husband she couldn't possibly desire. Some versions say it was political, a way to tie the craftsman god more tightly to Olympus by giving him a wife who would keep him invested in divine society. But no version suggests that anyone asked Hephaestus or Aphrodite what they wanted. No version suggests that this marriage was anything other than Zeus arranging divine pawns to serve his purposes. And, predictably, catastrophically, it didn't work. Aphrodite was the goddess of love and desire, and she felt neither for her husband. How could she? They had nothing in common. She was beautiful, he was ugly. She was social, he was isolated. She embodied pleasure and passion, he embodied labor and craftsmanship. They were opposite in every way that matters for romantic compatibility, thrown together by divine decree and expected to somehow make it work. And Aphrodite, being the goddess of love, did what came naturally. She had affairs. Multiple affairs. With Ares, most famously, the god of war, the embodiment of masculine violence and passion, everything Hephaestus wasn't, but also with mortal men, with other gods, with anyone who sparked desire in her. She was faithless, not out of cruelty, but out of nature. She was love and desire incarnate, and those forces don't confine themselves to unwanted marriages just because Zeus says they should. And Hephaestus knew. Of course he knew. Everyone knew. The affair between Aphrodite and Ares was the worst-kept secret on Olympus. The other gods whispered about it, probably laughed about it, probably pitied Hephaestus for being the cuckold husband who couldn't keep his beautiful wife satisfied. And for a while, Hephaestus endured it. Maybe because he was used to enduring. Maybe because he didn't know how to fight for respect when he'd never had it. Maybe because some part of him believed he didn't deserve better. That being married to Aphrodite at all was more than someone like him should expect. But eventually, the humiliation became too much, and Hephaestus did what he did best. He created a trap. He forged a net, so fine it was invisible, so strong it couldn't be broken, so cleverly designed it could capture anything caught within it. And he suspended this net above Aphrodite's bed, carefully, precisely, waiting for the moment when she and Ares would meet. When that moment came, when the lovers were together, Hephaestus triggered the net. It fell and bound them, naked and exposed, trapped in the act of betrayal. And Hephaestus, instead of confronting them privately, instead of handling his humiliation with discretion, did something that revealed the depth of his pain. He invited all the gods to come see, to witness his wife and her lover caught in flagrante delicto, to observe the betrayal that everyone had known about, but no one had acknowledged. He turned his private shame into public spectacle, because if he had to be humiliated, then everyone who'd participated in that humiliation through their silence and their mockery would have to look at what they'd enabled. The gods came. They looked, and according to the myth, they laughed. Not at Aphrodite and Ares, but at the situation, at the cleverness of the trap, at the sight of the god of war and the goddess of love literally caught in the act. Apollo joked to Hermes that even trapped in a net, he'd trade places with Ares to be with Aphrodite. The entire moment that should have vindicated Hephaestus, that should have forced the gods to acknowledge his mistreatment, became instead another scene where he was the joke, where his pain was entertainment, where even his legitimate grievance was transformed into comedy at his expense. And Hephaestus, standing there with his proof, with his anger, with his absolute right to rage and vengeance, was once again reminded that in Olympus, justice mattered less than beauty, that being right mattered less than being desirable, that even the wronged, ugly god was less sympathetic than the beautiful adulterers. What do you do with that? What do you do when you're right and it doesn't matter? When you've been betrayed and proving it just makes you look more pathetic? When the system you're part of considers you the joke, even in situations where you're clearly the victim? Hephaestus released the net eventually, freed Aphrodite and Ares, let them go back to their lives while he returned to his forge. And their marriage continued, if you can call it that, continued in name while being empty in every way that matters. Aphrodite stayed the goddess of love who loved everyone except her husband. Hephaestus stayed the craftsman who created miracles for gods who didn't respect him. And the wound, the original rejection that had defined him, was reinforced again. You are valuable for what you make, not for who you are. You are needed, not wanted. You are essential, not loved. But here's where Hephaestus' story reveals something profound about power and revenge and the long game of vindication. Hephaestus kept creating. He didn't stop working. He didn't withdraw his labor the way Demeter did. He didn't start wars or throw tantrums or demand recognition. He just kept making things, kept perfecting his craft, kept creating works of such extraordinary quality that even gods who despised him had to come to him when they needed something important. Every lightning bolt Zeus threw was forged by the son who'd been cast from Olympus. Every hero's armor, every divine weapon, every mechanical marvel that made the gods powerful came from the forge of the god they'd rejected. Hephaestus made himself irreplaceable, and in doing so, he achieved a form of revenge more complete than any of the dramatic divine punishments that fill Greek mythology. Because here's the truth about Hephaestus. He won. Not in the way that Zeus won, through violence and domination, not in the way that Demeter won, through ultimatum and destruction, but through sheer, undeniable excellence. Through being so good at what he did that even the people who'd thrown him away needed him more than he needed them. He was the only god who could forge Zeus's weapons, the only craftsman capable of creating things that would last for eternity, the only one with the skill and knowledge and sheer genius to solve problems that gods with greater beauty and power couldn't even understand. They needed him, and he knew it. And he used that need not to dominate them, but to secure his place, to ensure that he would never again be cast aside, never again be deemed disposable, never again be judged solely on his appearance rather than his contributions. That's a different kind of power story. Not the power that comes from being born perfect or blessed or destined for greatness, but the power that comes from surviving rejection and building something from the wreckage, from taking the parts of yourself that others deemed worthless and forging them into excellence, from proving through work and dedication and the slow accumulation of undeniable skill that value isn't determined by appearance or circumstance of birth or whether people like you. Value is determined by what you can do, what you can create, what you can contribute that no one else can replicate. Hephaestus didn't need people to love him. He didn't need to be beautiful or charming or socially successful. He needed to be necessary. And once you're necessary, once you're the only one who can do what needs doing, then the people who rejected you have to come back, have to ask for help, have to acknowledge, however grudgingly, that they were wrong about you. But let's not pretend that vindication heals all wounds, because Hephaestus' story doesn't have a happy ending where everything gets resolved and everyone learns their lesson. The wound of rejection, especially rejection by a parent, especially rejection for something you can't control, like disability or appearance, doesn't heal just because you become successful. It shapes you. It informs every relationship you have, every decision you make, every moment moment when you have to choose between vulnerability and protection. Hephaestus became the greatest craftsman in existence, but he was still the god that limped, still the god that other gods considered ugly, still the god whose wife preferred literally anyone else, still the god who'd been thrown off Olympus and whose mother never apologized, never acknowledged the cruelty, never showed remorse for what she'd done. Hera and Hephaestus had a complicated relationship after his return. He made things for her. She used his skills when she needed them. They interacted with the cold politeness of family members who share blood but not affection. In some versions of the myths, Hephaestus eventually forgave her, or at least stopped actively resenting her. In other versions, the wound stayed open forever, a chasm between mother and son that nothing could bridge. But all versions acknowledge that their relationship was fundamentally broken, that whatever bond should have existed between them had been severed the moment Hera chose divine perfection over maternal love. And that choice, that decision to throw away her child rather than accept his imperfection, haunted both of them. Hera lost a son. Hephaestus lost the possibility of ever believing that he could be loved for himself rather than for what he could provide. There's a version of Hephaestus' story that doesn't get told as often, a detail that reveals something crucial about his character. He was kind. Despite everything he'd suffered, despite all the reasons he had to become bitter and cruel and vengeful, Hephaestus was actually one of the gentler gods. He helped heroes who asked for his aid. He crafted gifts without demanding impossible prices. He taught mortals the arts of metalworking and craftsmanship, sharing his knowledge rather than hoarding it. When Prometheus was chained to a rock for giving fire to humanity, it was Hephaestus who was ordered to forge the chains, and he did it with tears, with reluctance, with open sympathy for the titan who defied Zeus. Hephaestus understood what it meant to be punished for things beyond your control, understood what it meant to suffer because the powerful decided you deserved suffering. That kindness is remarkable given his history. Trauma usually produces one of two outcomes. It either makes you cruel because you've learned that cruelty is how the world operates, or it makes you kind because you know what suffering feels like and refuse to inflict it on others. Hephaestus chose kindness. Not naively, not blindly, but deliberately, consciously, as an act of resistance against the cruelty he'd experienced. He could have become bitter, could have used his skills to create weapons of revenge, to punish everyone who'd ever wronged him, to make the gods who'd rejected him pay for their cruelty. Instead, he built things, created beauty, helped people, became the god that mortals actually respected and appreciated because he gave them tools to improve their lives, rather than demanding worship and sacrifice for his own glory. That's heroism of a quiet kind, not the heroism of battle or dramatic gestures or legendary deeds, but the heroism of choosing to be better than your trauma allows you to be, of deciding that even though the world hurt you, you won't hurt it back, of using your skills to create rather than destroy, to help rather than harm, to be the person you needed when you were suffering. Hephaestus was thrown away for being imperfect, and instead of internalizing that rejection, instead of becoming cruel or bitter or broken, he became the god who created perfection, who proved that worth comes from within, from what you do with your existence, from the choice to be excellent even when no one expects anything from you except failure. But there's also sadness in that story, a tragedy that excellence can't overcome. Because Hephaestus should have been loved regardless of his skills, should have been valued for existing, not for producing, should have had relationships based on who he was rather than what he could make. And instead, his entire life became about justifying his existence through output, about proving his worth through creation, about securing love and respect and belonging through being useful rather than being himself. That's not a victory. That's survival. That's making the best of an unbearable situation. That's turning trauma into purpose, because purpose is the only thing that makes the trauma bearable. And yes, Hephaestus succeeded. Yes, he became irreplaceable. Yes, he proved everyone wrong. But the cost of that success was a life where he never got to find out if anyone would have loved him without the armor and weapons and miracles he created. A life where every relationship was transactional, every interaction was conditional, every moment of connection was built on what he could provide rather than who he was. The forge still burns in Greek mythology, still produces the weapons and armor and mechanical marvels that define divine power. And Hephaestus still tends it, still creates, still proves his worth through excellence that no other god can match. But he does it alone, in his workshop, away from the banquets and celebrations and divine society that never quite accepted him. He has his work, he has his craft. He has the satisfaction of being necessary, of being irreplaceable, of being the one god that even Zeus can't do without. And maybe that's enough. Maybe making yourself so essential that you can never be cast away again is its own form of victory. Maybe surviving rejection and building a life from the wreckage is all the heroism that's possible. Maybe Hephaestus, the god they threw away, the child his mother rejected, the husband his wife betrayed, is actually the most successful god in the pantheon, because he defined success on his own terms, rather than accepting the definitions that others imposed on him. Or maybe it's just sad. Maybe the story of Hephaestus is ultimately a tragedy about a god who deserved better and never got it, who should have been loved unconditionally and never was, who built miracles from rejection and proved his worth 1,000 times over and still never received the one thing he actually needed: acceptance that wasn't conditional on his usefulness. Both things can be true. Hephaestus can be victorious and wounded, successful and traumatized, irreplaceable and alone. He can be the god who won by making himself necessary and the god who lost because necessity isn't the same as love. He can be the craftsman whose work will outlast every other god's achievements and the child who was thrown off Olympus and never fully climbed back up. Not really. Not in the ways that matter most. So when you see craftsmanship, when you encounter something made with such skill and care that it transcends its function and becomes art, think of Hephaestus. Think of the god who learned to create in darkness, who forged beauty from rejection, who proved that worth comes from within even when the world insists otherwise. Think of the god who was thrown away and survived, who was rejected and became irreplaceable, who was deemed imperfect and created perfection anyway. That's the real legacy of Hephaestus, not the weapons or armor or mechanical marvels, though those matter, but the simple, powerful truth that being cast aside doesn't define you unless you let it, that surviving rejection is possible, that excellence is the best revenge, that sometimes the people who hurt you will eventually need you, and you get to decide whether that need is enough, whether being necessary compensates for never being loved, whether proving them all wrong makes up for the fact that you had to prove yourself at all. Hephaestus never answered that question definitively. He just kept working, kept creating, kept the forge burning. And maybe that's answer enough. Maybe continuing, despite everything, is the only victory that really matters.